Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Center for Learning Health System Sciences for our monthly Impact seminar. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few expectations. Today's seminar will be recorded. You can enable closed captioning by hitting the Show Captions button next to the Raise Hand option in the Zoom menu. The public slide deck will also be made available on our website under the Education tab. I'll post the link in the chat along with a short questionnaire asking for seminar topic and speaker suggestions. Following the presentation, we invite you to raise your hand or type questions in the Q&A. In particular, we welcome questions exploring the many dimensions of impact that these ideas, technologies, and practices have on learning health systems. As a reminder for upcoming LHS events, the next seminar will be on May 6th with Dr. Lin Ying Chong. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sheila Maroney to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Andy. It's generous of you to put doctor in front of my name, but I haven't qualified for that nomenclature yet. But nonetheless, I'm Sheila Maroney. I am serving as an advisor to class for the patient and family partner involvement in research. And I'm very happy today to introduce Roz Schneider. I'm going to read her impressive bio, but I think what often gets lost in people's bios is the real personal impact that they've had on the world. And I can personally attest with a front row seat to Roz's commitment to patient and family engagement in healthcare, and particularly in research, and specifically around the development of medicines, which you'll hear a lot of from her directly. But I wanted to just give you my personal testimony before reading this really rich bio. Roz is a visionary in human-centered design in biopharmaceutical research and healthcare, embedding intentional listening and co-creation with patients, along with other key stakeholders to drive positive outcomes. With experience spanning clinical practice, academia, and hospital administration in internal medicine, pulmonary, and critical care medicine, as well as leadership roles at Pfizer, Theravance, BioMarin, and independent consulting, Roz has consistently aligned practices with patients and healthcare providers' articulated needs. A mentor and advocate for gender equity, she's held leadership roles in professional associations and has received numerous accolades, including the Global Fellowship in Medicine's Development and recognition from the City College of New York School of Medicine. Additionally, Roz is an active member of Women Executives on Boards, the Exceptional Women Alliance, serves as chair of the board for the American Lung Association's New Jersey chapter, is a board member of the Global Medicine Development Program Academy, King's College of London, and strategic advisory board member of Proof Pilot. We are more than thrilled to have Roz as this month's Impact Seminar speaker as she discusses patient centricity in medicine development with, and, all capitals, for patients. Thank you very much, Roz, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you. And then when you're done, we'll have a chance for a discussion.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for that very generous introduction. So I will share my screen and you'll tell me if it's working.
It's good? Working, yes.
Okay, beautiful. So, except that I moved you all the way over there. So if you see me looking over here, I'm still paying attention, but I just want to see your faces. So the idea of with and for patients is very close to my heart, because we all go into these fields in medicine because we want to do some good in the world, for the world, and for patients. But over the years, it became very clear to me that it's not only for patients, but to be our best for patients, it has to be with patients. And I'll get my disclosures out of the way. I've worked for a number of companies in the last several years, including the consulting that I do now. And you already heard about my board positions and advisory positions. But everything I discussed today, it's my own views and doesn't necessarily represent any of the organizations that I've been affiliated with. I show this picture because it represents a major factor of why I'm doing what I'm doing now and for the last several years. And that is when I was in clinical practice in internal medicine, pulmonary and critical care in New York, in Beth Israel Medical Center, about half of the beds on the medical floors were filled with people living with HIV and AIDS before we had the terrific medicines that we have now to treat people with HIV. And the loud chant that we heard from the patient community was "nothing about us without us," which had been spoken by other organizations and communities before, but actually dates back to the 16th century. So this concept of nothing about us without us and decisions about us should not be made without us is not a new concept, but again, it was very loudly spoken and very powerful during this era in the 80s and 90s particularly. And what I saw was the tremendous power of the intersection of engagement, advocacy, and activism of the community with science, innovation, medicine, and policy. And what we saw, what the world saw, is that that made a huge difference for people living with this condition. And it didn't only have that effect for the people living with this condition. The patients and communities demanded to be heard by Wall Street, which is where they're laying down in front of the New York Stock Exchange here, but also to be heard by the regulatory authorities in the United States by the FDA, and Europe by EMA, and also by the media before we had social media, but to really be out there to raise awareness that the adage of patients are waiting, as if they are a group of passive people that are just waiting through the slow systems that we had to develop medicines and get access to medicines, was just not working for them and was unacceptable for this community. So I would say it was a pivotal time in the development of medicines and other technologies of patient advocacy, engagement, and activism that really changed the way medicines are developed, approved, and made accessible. So again, a huge influence in my life and in my choosing to do this work within industry. I want to set the stage with some terminology that you'll hear thrown around and that I'll use, just to say that these definitions are through my lens, having worked in the biopharmaceutical industry and having worked with patients and other stakeholders in coalitions over the years, so that we know what we're talking about. You hear a lot about patient centricity. The way that I see this is that it's an aspirational goal. I don't think we're there yet across the board, but it's an umbrella goal that patients, and when I say patients, I mean people who are living with the condition that they have, also their families and their care partners, that patients are included across the entire life cycle of medical product and services development, and that patients are included as they're included in the foundational relationships and as key stakeholders in the activities, but not only in the activities, but also stakeholders in the decision-making when it comes to anything about them related to medical product and services development. And that includes a better understanding of the patient community's needs and preferences. That includes that the development, communication, and commercialization will help ensure access and improve health outcomes, as well as the business outcomes that are expected in the biopharmaceutical industry. Now, patient engagement is part of being patient-centric, and that is the patient engagement is that intentional process for involving patients end-to-end, by which patient centricity is then achieved. And I include another term, lived experience expert, because patient communities have told us over the years that they don't love the term patient. I don't either, because it further accentuates that hierarchy between systems and professionals and the people who are living with their condition. And they have so much to offer, and they are truly the best experts on what it's like to live with their condition. So some people will at times use the term lived experience expert to represent someone living with a diagnosis that includes their families and their care partners. And then further, you can distinguish two types of patient and family engagement. from one another. They're distinct, but they affect one another. They're both important in achieving patient centricity. And this is terminology that was coined by a friend and advocate, Sue Schrant, that many of you may know. Type A, or individual patient engagement, versus type B, or more systematic or organizational patient engagement. And type A is that active partnership with patients and families in their own care, in their own participation in clinical trials, for example, for their own improvement of their experience with either of those. Whereas type B, or systematic patient engagement, is that we're working side by side with patients and family members who become partners in, for example, something at the organizational level, for example, in the planning, conduct, and dissemination of clinical trials. But that's not for their own benefit or their own care at that particular time. So again, you can see that one affects the other and they're both important. But it's important to think about them separately as we plan for activities and relationships. And when I'm saying end-to-end, I'm laying out sort of the product life cycle of developing medical products, medicines, medical technologies, and the engagement and involvement of patients is important from the very beginning, from the time of discovery, before you ever have a first-in-human clinical trial. We need to understand aspects of the lived experience that patients have. We need to understand what it is they need. Where are the gaps in their care based on what we already have now? And we also have to have at least a high-level landscape of how the patient community is organized in their patient organizations. Are the patient organizations truly representative of the people living with that condition? Or are we going to have to search well beyond patient organizations to understand that lived experience? And within those patient organizations, how do they want to work with sponsors, and what are the things that are their primary areas of focus? Those are things that are very good to know early on as we're prioritizing what we should work on. And then that's when we start building foundational relationships in any particular therapeutic area, or as a company, just across the company and across the work we do, getting the input from the patient community on what it means to them for a company like ours to be patient-centered. Not talking about products, not talking about even any specific therapeutic area. So that's that foundational relationship that starts very early on, and that is an iterative process over time, where we build into the plans just the same way as we build in anything else into the development plan, interactions and activities with the patient community to involve them. And this is all at the systematic level, or that type B patient involvement, so that when we're doing our clinical research and designing our clinical trials, that we can align on what are the meaningful outcomes to the community, to the patients, and what order would they put them in? Because that matters too, as you know, in designing clinical trials. Would these clinical trials be feasible for participants and their families to get to or to participate in? And what kinds of tools might we use? And anything that's patient-facing to raise awareness of that particular trial and to recruit somebody into a clinical trial. Anything that's patient-facing should have had patients' eyes on it to review it at the very least, or at the very best, is co-created with the patient community, so that, again, it would be relevant for the audience it's intended for. And also within the clinical research timeframe, when we start gathering evidence that comes out of these clinical trials, we need to understand from the patient community how they view benefit, risk, and uncertainty based on the evidence that comes out of this research. And they can also help us to translate that clinical research into lay language that'll be more relevant for patients in the community. we get to a next step once we're at a particular stage of the clinical research where we're bringing that evidence to regulatory agencies and also moving towards, once approved, launching those products and gaining access in particular markets for those medicines or devices. And at that point, in order to submit those applications to health authorities and payers, it's important that they understand the lived experience of the patient community. So sponsors will benefit from bringing in the community, again, the community that they've interacted with along the way, to share that lived experience so that the regulators and payers might appreciate that, and bringing them in various ways, either live at meetings or by including their experiences in the packets of submissions and including their experiences in different ways, both to add color and context to what it's like to living with that condition, but also bringing in robust patient experience data to be able to include in the decision making and also in the labeling of that particular product. And here too, when there are communications that are going out at this stage, anything patient facing should certainly include patients from the community to make sure that it's both relevant and also in language that makes sense, as well as for any support programs. And I should say at this point that the rules of engaging with patients once you have a product are very different in the United States than they are outside of the United States. And we always have to be sure that we're compliant with any local and regional laws and regulation, no matter what we're doing. And in particular, around marketed products in countries where there are more limitations in discussion of products outside of the United States. And then when we move to this last phase, which is post-launch and maturity, the important thing is that our engagement with patients and our responsibility with patients is for the duration. It's for as long as that medicine or product is available to anyone, anywhere in the world. So it behooves us to still stay engaged so we understand the perspectives that people have as time goes on, as more people use the product, as they may have new perspectives on the benefit, risk, and uncertainty. And as time goes on, there are also other products that will be coming out that may shift the views and the preferences of the patient community. So this is what I mean when I'm saying end-to-end engagement. And again, it has to be designed in. It's not something that you add on because there's money left over at the end of a quarter or because this is a nice thing to do. This is something that has to be built into processes the same way as you build in advice from healthcare professionals, from statisticians, from regulatory experts, because these are lived experience experts and our most critical stakeholder. I've selected some application examples of patient engagement here with some links that you can explore afterwards. But I mentioned regulatory patient engagement. And this first one is the FDA engaging with patients themselves, right? With the FDA's patient-focused drug development meetings, which were part of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, as well as guidance around patient engagement that came out of the 21st Century Cures Act. That these are meetings with the patient community so that the FDA can listen in public meetings to the experience of living with a condition, the experience with the treatments that are currently available and what's missing. And they know in the FDA that they are limited in resources, so can't hold all the meetings that they would like to hold. So they've also created guidance on how external organizations like patient organizations can bring together their communities and multiple stakeholders to hold externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. And FDA officials will attend those meetings so that they'll still get the benefit of hearing from the community. And then after these meetings, the voice of the patient reports come out of all of these meetings. And I know I personally have included the information from these voice of the patient reports in FDA submissions with some of the companies where I've worked. Another example is advisory boards that are patient advisory boards that the company engages patients in. One in particular that I'll highlight is in a particular skin condition. What we learned, there's always an aha moment. So when the clinical teams are listening to patients and they've had their head down working on this program for a long time, when they heard from patients in looking at a clinical trial planned protocol, they learned that the priority was less about the number of skin lesions, but also about how much they were itching, because that's what was keeping them up at night. And that's what was making them uncomfortable in group situations, that they were itching and people would see them itching. The other thing is they would take many more lesions as far as number to not have any on their face, because that was something that was socially very difficult for people with this skin condition. So it was something to be learned and to include in looking at our clinical program. The other thing was just procedurally, how much time you needed to be off of a particular medicine to participate in that clinical trial. And when the original plan was to stay off of medicines for a week, because that's the way that these trials have been done before, the family members and the patients who were represented said, you are going to lose a lot of people who won't want to stay off of that medicine that they were already on for a week, because they know how they're going to feel after a week. And it's not going to be worth it for them to participate in your trial. Couldn't it be shorter? And going back, looking at the science and integrating it with that input, with those insights, we were able to reduce the washout time so that what was written in the protocol was you had to be off of the medicines for 72 hours instead of for a week. And we do believe that that improved our ability to recruit. Now, in this next example of Parkinson's disease clinical trial program, the caveat is that it wasn't a controlled trial of two different clinical trials, but we had one clinical trial that was being planned with all of the usual experts of scientists and physicians and statisticians and regulators, all that, and another program, another clinical trial protocol that was being advanced that was very similar, but where we also engaged with patients, lived experience experts, to tell us what they thought about the protocol. And the one that included patients enrolled 6 weeks earlier than expected, and the one that didn't include patients was lagging far behind even their anticipated timelines, except when we put in mitigations that were based on what we heard from the patients in the one that had accelerated, and then that study also caught up when it came to enrollment. So we saw that as a tremendous value, both for the patient community that will also benefit from shortened timelines, and to the company. Another couple of examples from Pfizer are regarding return of data and return of results of clinical trials. And this is an example of both type A and type B patient engagement, because the design of these programs, of how we should be delivering the data and the results to patients, was designed with patients. That's that type B kind of systematic involvement of patients. Overwhelmingly, we know that patients would like to know the results of the clinical trials they participate in, and they also would like their own data, like what were my data in those studies. So Pfizer has a mechanism now to return both of those to participants, and also plain language summaries, the summary results of the clinical trials to the public, and they post them at these links. There are also a number of working groups and councils and roundtables that I've been connected with, where I have the links here, as well as Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI. I know that you had a presentation related to PCORI in this forum as well. It's a terrific organization, but they're very clear that the grants are dependent on a number of things, including that there is obvious patient engagement from beginning to end, and that it's built in, and they don't just include it as a yes, no, but the applicants have to show how they plan to engage with patients all along the way for them to be considered for those important grants. And last, I will mention the National Health Council Working Group on Patient Experience Mapping. And here is the map from that toolkit that I'm grateful to have worked on with National Health Council, which is an umbrella patient organization in the United States of other patient organizations. And a lot has been discussed about the patient journey in companies. And often in the old days, what you would see when it came to patient journeys is not a patient journey at all, but how does the patient get from their diagnosis to the medicine that we have developed, and to keep them on that medicine. That's not a patient journey, that's a journey to the medicine. This is more of a holistic view of a patient experience, and we're calling it patient experience mapping rather than patient journey, because the patients involved in this project told us that it's really, when you say patient journey, it makes it seem like they're going on a vacation with their condition, and it's not that at all. So patient experience mapping within this toolkit are templates that can be modified no matter who is using this for their information, whether it's a patient organization or a sponsor organization or an academic organization who wants to understand that lived experience in the separate islands of what it's like before you ever get to a diagnosis and all of the circles you go through, the island of getting to a diagnosis, which again can go backwards into the I still don't have a diagnosis, and then into the living with a diagnosis and the options of if there are medicines available, if there is access to care, or if there are clinical trials available. All of that is in the living with a diagnosis island. And with all of that across all of the islands, we recognize that there are the life factors that you see on the top of the screen that influence that experience of living with a condition. That is your family and support system, your work or student life, your housing. How am I going to get to your clinical trial or to the doctor's office if the expert is hundreds of miles away from where I live? What's my access to healthcare, insurance, mental health, and other health conditions? Because often when you're creating a journey map to a medicine, you're assuming that you can only focus on that particular condition, not recognizing that those folks may have a number of other medical conditions and be on a number of other medicines that will affect how that looks. So this is intended to be a more holistic view, and I would encourage you to look at this body of tools. Some more tools are with the Patient-Focused Medicine Development Coalition, and this is the Patient Engagement Quality Guidance, which was developed so that we could talk about patient engagement not just as a yes, no, we did it, but as something where we strive for it to be of high quality patient engagement, whether it's the long-term patient engagement or any particular activity that is a patient engagement. And the domains that we came up with, again, in a multi-stakeholder group, were shared purpose. What is the focus of the patient organizations or patients that you're working with? And what is the company trying to achieve with this particular activity? And we have very different stakeholders, so it's important that we recognize we don't have to agree on everything, but we need to agree that there's a reason for us to be working together on this one thing that we're working on. And respect our differences, but also just respect each other and make sure that however we're planning this activity, that it's accessible to everybody who's participating, that we have representativeness of the stakeholders, or just recognize if we have the lack of representativeness of the stakeholders, because I practiced medicine for 20 years and I never saw the patient. I always saw an individual person in front of me who had their individual experience. And we can't possibly include everybody in every activity, but we want to do the best we can to have representativeness of our stakeholders that we're trying to reach. We need to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are clear when we're participating in any of these activities, and that the groups or patients that we're working with have the capacity for that particular engagement. And when I say that, patient organizations have a wide variety of sophistication, from people who are very early on in developing their patient organization to very sophisticated, large patient organizations that include their own registries and their own scientific governance and that do their own research. And you have to be sure that the people who you're bringing in know what to expect from this engagement. And if they need to have certain capabilities for that engagement, that either we look for those people who have those capabilities or we help them build those capabilities to be able to participate. So for example, it's not fair to say we want your input on this clinical trial protocol and hand it to people who have never once seen a clinical trial protocol and don't really know what you're talking about. So that's the number 5 domain. Number 6 is transparency and communication in the documentation for whatever this activity is. That we should be clear from the start that as a sponsor organization, there may be things we can't share after we finish with this. We may be able to say to you, we were able to take into account X, Y, and Z that you told us, and we're very grateful. There were things that we couldn't take into account for this next iteration, and this is the reason. Or we can say we weren't able to do that and we're not able to share the reason, because there are things that are proprietary. And above all, we want to make sure that we don't share anything with patients that would disadvantage them so that they couldn't work with another sponsor. We want patients to be able to work with whoever they feel comfortable working with, and to raise all boats in this healthcare system. And last but not least is the continuity and sustainability for whatever we're working on, to make sure that we don't start over every single time and forget that we did this activity before. So this is in general, and there are other tools related to this on the PFMD site, what we think about when we think of quality patient engagement. Now, when we also think about the value of patient engagement to sponsors, you almost wonder why you would need to do that, because this is so obviously the right thing to do. It's the human thing to do, to involve your most important stakeholders all along the way in what you're doing that is for them. But at the same time, companies are corporations that have accountability to their shareholders, as well as in doing all of the other right things for humanity. They do have to demonstrate that what they are spending their money and resources on makes sense from a shareholder standpoint. And there is a lot of evidence now that shows that it has tremendous value to engage with patients and to be patient-centric. So we have this reference from The Economist looking at patient-centric clinical trial programs that included aspects that were considered patient-centric. They had in phase 2 and phase 3 demonstrated 40% faster enrollment, and also a 21% increased likelihood of market launch. And then we have the next bullet talks about a framework for tracking engagement activities and outcomes that was published by Novartis after working in a multi-stakeholder project to put this out, to again make it easier for people to plan and to justify the resources that they need to do this work. And then last is the risk-adjusted financial model that was created by Bennett Levitan, Ken Getz, and others that looked at specifically clinical trial amendments, each of which may be very costly and time-consuming, as well as the speed of enrollment for clinical programs, and they demonstrated that the value to the sponsor might exceed 500-fold the investment in the patient engagement. So these are important things to keep in mind when you say, of course we should be doing this. And there are other metrics that I'll just show you where they are. Again, the PFMD website. Depending on who in the organization you're trying to tell the story of why it's so important and valuable to engage with patients, you may choose different metrics to highlight to them. And there are, I believe, around 90 metrics. No, it says 115 now in this section of tools. So where are we, since we know that it's important to do and it's valuable to do? The Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development and Ken Getz have done a lot of work in understanding where we are and where the barriers are in engaging with patients and in being more patient-centered when it comes to clinical trials. And they have done this body of work in a study out of Tufts to say, if you ask most companies, or across the companies they studied, whether they're piloting any of these items that you see here that are viewed as patient-centered, patient-focused, that almost all of them are, or at least the large majority, are doing some of this work in pilots or in parts of their organization. But when you ask them about routinely using these items in their phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, you can see that the numbers are much lower. So there's a lot more to do, a lot of room to grow, to be that continuous learning organization that we all want to be, so that we have intentional, iterative involvement of representative stakeholders end to end, so that we can have products and services that meet the needs and the wants that are articulated by the lived experience experts who we are in this business to serve. And with that, I say thank you, and any questions are more than welcome, and comments.
All right, thank you all. We have about 13 minutes remaining for the Q&A. If you have questions or comments, please use the raise your hand feature. We also welcome you to type your questions into the Zoom Q&A.
So I have about 20, Andy. So while the rest of the group is gathering their thoughts, if you don't mind, I'll ask a question. Thank you, Roz, very much. I'm really struck by, while your work in industry has many different inputs, shareholders, FDA approval, market share, et cetera, that are different forces than those who are on this call. Some of those who are on this call who are involved in health services research in systems and processes and healthcare delivery. I'm really struck by the parallels between the two worlds, particularly in your description of end-to-end engagement. And I think that while we don't have shareholders, we certainly have stakeholders to whom we're responsible. And I think one of the most important points you made was this notion of being engaged and keeping people engaged for the duration. And not only, it's not that they're engaged in our work, but that we are continuing to communicate with them. And it was one of the most poignant stories I ever heard was from a mom, and some of you on this call have heard me tell the stories from a mom who had a 14-year-old boy with a fatal illness, and they agreed to fly regularly to New York to be involved in a study, even though they knew he wasn't going to be a direct beneficiary of it. And they never heard anything back about the study. And before he died, he said to his mom, "I just wish I knew if I had actually helped anybody." And it was really a very poignant story about the power of communication and staying engaged for the duration, even if the results are not good, even if they're not positive. People want to know, like you said, what happened. Do you have any guidance about effective tools for keeping people in the loop through the end?
Sure. So I think for participants, the the set of rules that anything we're going to be doing to communicate with participants has to, of course, go through IRB and be planned. But there are a number of tools that were worked on in a different coalition called Transcelerate about both the returning clinical trials, and that was also done with Harvard MRCT, where they have tools as well. But one of the things that we heard from participants is like exactly the story that you've told us, which is, not even a thank you, not even not even a thank you or a what came of this, because sometimes you won't know for years with multi-year trials what the outcome is, right? So you can't share necessarily in the interim, but you might be able to share if everybody, if it's planned and approved, to say, we've now recruited half of the people who will participate in this trial, and thank you so much for the work that for the investment that you've made of yourself to the health of the people in the community. There are ways to do this, but you have to plan it. And who should deliver that is, again, something that can be planned. It's usually the people at the sites who will provide this to the clinical trial sites, who will provide this to the participants. And then, for example, for those links, like for Pfizer also has an alumni community of people who've participated in clinical trials so that they can keep up with other clinical trials, but also where they can get their results. On that last visit at the site in participating with the study is when they would generally get a notice that has the link for where they could sign up for this if they wanted to. Because there are some people who, even though the vast majority want to know, you also have the right not to know. So it's just a matter of planning and understanding that this is something that people want. And there are a lot of parallels between industry and academic clinical trials, but also academic practice. I mean, when I was in the ICU caring for people, there was a lot that we could do, but we had to do not just what we could do based on the technology at the time, but what we should do based on the way this person lives their life. And the only way to know that is to explore with the person and their family, and to do that early on, because you don't want to do it in an emergency, we'll say, in the hospital.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, it looks like we have a question from Shelley. How do research projects have meaningful patient engagement prior to funding? What happens to that relationship if funding is not granted?
There has to be some structure. First of all, there's a lot you can do without funding in outreach to introduce yourselves to a particular patient organization. And there's an understanding, especially amongst the more sophisticated patient organizations, that if you're reaching out early, either early in development of a product, that may never become a product, because most early stage research for a particular product doesn't become a product, because it just doesn't. I know you all know this, so I won't go into that, right? But the same goes for if you're trying to get funding for something, for a particular type of project. People also know that funding is hard to come by. So you might not get the funding. And it doesn't give enough respect to the community to say you'd only want to talk to us if you're sure that it's going to be successful, or you're sure when we're going to get the grant, right? They have the work that they do to serve their constituents and are willing to do some of that at risk. Companies will often say, oh, but if we have to go back to them and say we stopped the program for any number of reasons, they're not going to be able to handle it. That's really not true. They've handled a lot with their lived experiences and in developing their patient organizations. They can handle it if you're not going to be able to move forward. And having said that, if you're in an organization, but you don't have that particular grant, what would be good is to have some bucket of funding for the things that you do across your organization so that you'll be ready when you can have the funding for different kinds of engagement. But often nobody knows where that comes from because everybody is so focused on that particular bucket that they own. That's where you have to advocate within your own organization that you need a little bit of it, even if it's small, an Uber bucket of doing the things that are good for everyone and the whole organization, and not just for that one particular project.
It looks like next, looks like this is less of a question, more of a comment. Maybe you can give your thoughts on. Someone says, one of the challenges in working with patient organizations is a hidden agenda, often for advocacy. Many large patient organizations receive funding from corporate sponsors, which may influence their perspectives.
So I think this is where sunlight is very helpful, and where disclosure of any relationships is a very good thing. And to understand what those relationships are is a very good thing, because there's no question that a lot of patient organizations rely on sponsorships from corporations because there's a lot that they want to do, and what they do costs a lot of money, right? And there are ways that they outline how they request that that sponsorship, and what's the purpose of that sponsorship, or whether it's a donation. And there's a difference, because if it's a donation, then that's philanthropy, and wherever it's coming from, the people who are donating should have nothing to do with and should get no benefit out of that donation that's given. Versus if it's a sponsorship where there's some tangible benefit to the person who's giving that support, right? Versus a collaboration where there's an expectation that you're actually all in it together and that everybody is benefiting. So the key to that is to make sure that when you're planning any of these things, that that there isn't undue influence, but that there is transparency in what that looks like whenever there are any finances involved. And there are usually finances involved, no matter who is working with whatever group. Because again, the patient organizations also need to have their work done that costs their investment of people and money. But the hidden agenda part of the question is, that's where having a foundational relationship over and with discussions over time is very helpful, because you get to know each other. You get to know each other, and you're honest with each other, or at least try to be honest with each other about why you're doing this together, right? And if it's that we're working with you for this reason, that doesn't mean we're not working with others for another reason, right? And it's still, we have to have some confidence in the patient communities that they are doing what they say they want to do for their stakeholders, and it's for their boards and for their communities to hold them accountable that they're really doing that.
All right. It looks like we don't have any other questions. Sheila, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
I hope this isn't like throwing a grenade into the middle of the table, and we promised each other to remain apolitical. So this is with that caveat. There has been a tremendous amount of growth and support at the federal level for patient engagement and patient-centered care in general. What do you think will happen with person-centered initiatives and the role of the voice of the patient at the federal level in the programs that are all relevant to the group here today? And how can we help protect this important work?
Well, I don't have that crystal ball to say what might happen. I have concerns. I think we all should have concerns anytime there's a big transition, because any disruption might open up opportunities that are good opportunities, but also slow certain things down that were already working very well, and move people around and move projects around in a way that I see as very problematic for us in this whole ecosystem. Having said that, I have hope, and I'm optimistic that the patient community and the research community and also the business community will see the value of all working together towards those goals that we all hold out there as why we get up and do what we do every day. But am I worried? Yes, I'm quite worried. And because again, no matter what any of us think about the changes as they're happening, they are causing tremendous disruption, and disruption in ways that we didn't imagine. And we're saying we helped to build this, and there were parts of this at least that were already with a clear trajectory in the right direction that are either stopped or stalled. And how is that going to affect things in the future? I think we don't know. But we could sit around and talk about how terrible it is, or we can say, what can we do to make sure that our eye remains on the true North Star of why we do this? And then we can help to get us back on track. I hope.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schneider, for taking the time to give this talk, and thank you everyone for attending. Again, in closing, please join us for our next seminar on May 6th at noon Central Time. This concludes our presentation. See everyone next time.